The professor stood alone in the greenhouse long after the students had gone home. The glass walls were misted with rain, and the lamps above the rows of plants cast soft halos of gold and green. He could hear the steady hum of the air system pushing warmth through the room, a sound that had become as familiar to him as breathing itself. He looked at the plant before him, the one they had all begun to whisper about, the one with leaves that seemed to shift colors when the light changed, sometimes emerald, sometimes bronze, sometimes almost black, as if the plant were hiding its true face from him. He had found it not far from the river during a research trip with his assistant. The memory still clung to him like the scent of damp soil. The air had been thick that day, the forest too quiet. He had noticed the plant growing where nothing else would, the ground around it littered with the husks of insects and small bones, a silent warning that nature had drawn a border he should not cross. But curiosity was always louder than caution. He had taken a sample, carefully wrapped it, and brought it back to the university where the experiments began. Had tested its toxins on microscopic samples and watched the cells collapse as if erased from existence within seconds. It worked faster than anything he had ever seen, faster than any venom, faster than any synthetic compound. It was not just deadly, it was efficient, almost elegant in the way it dismantled life. He had stared at the data for hours, unable to decide if he felt awe or horror. His colleagues had laughed when he told them. At first they said he must have contaminated his results. He said no plant could do that, but then they came to see for themselves, and the laughter stopped. When the first insect test ended in silence, the plant did not wilt, did not release smoke or flame. It simply existed in perfect calm while the life around it faded. It was quiet death disguised as beauty. That he began to keep it separate from the others, giving it its own enclosure, a glass dome that hissed faintly when sealed. He wrote warnings on every note, every jar, every label. He told his students to keep their distance, to treat it not as a specimen, but as a predator in waiting. Yet even as he said the words, he found himself drawn closer, studying the curves of its leaves, the faint shimmer on their surface like fine dust that caught the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. At night he dreamed of it. He dreamed of standing in a field where thousands of the plants swayed under a green sun, the air heavy with their scent and his lungs burning, but he could not turn away. Because in the dream it whispered to him in a language older than sound. It told him that death was never cruel, only efficient, that the balance of the world depended on the ones who could end life as easily as they could begin. He woke sweating every morning, telling himself that science required distance, that emotion had no place in discovery. But when he looked into the dome and saw the faint movement of the leaves, he could not help but feel that the plant was aware that it was watching him just as closely as he was watching it, and that somewhere between them something ancient and dangerous had begun to stir. The morning came with a pale light pressing through the fogged glass of the greenhouse. The professor had not slept. He moved like a shadow between the rows of plants, every footstep slow, as though he feared the floor itself might betray him. The air was damp and tasted faintly of metal. His hands trembled not from age, but from the feeling that the world around him was holding its breath. He approached the dome, where the lethal plant waited, and saw dew gathered on the glass, tiny beads that reflected his own eyes back at him. Dozens of times over he thought how strange it was that something so small could hold so much power and yet remain so quiet, so patient. He whispered good morning, though he did not know why. The words slipped out like instinct, like a greeting between two creatures that recognized one another in their solitude. He leaned closer, studying the fine veins of the leaves, the shimmer of pollen that glowed faintly when the light touched it. The scent drifted again, soft but sharp, with that same note of spice that tugged at something distant in his memory. It was not unpleasant, but it carried a weight that made his chest tighten. He wrote notes in his journal describing the density of the air, the rate of pollen release, the strange pulse of heat the plant seemed to generate from within, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. When the assistant arrived, a young man with restless eyes and a voice always eager to impress, the professor told him to prepare another round of tests, this time with fruit flies and higher airflow control. The assistant hesitated, saying they had already seen enough. The professor ignored him. He had seen too many discoveries die under the weight of hesitation. He told the boy that fear was the enemy of knowledge and that progress demanded risk. The words sounded noble, but they felt hollow even as he said them. As the test began, he adjusted the chamber pressure. The machine hummed, the insects buzzed for a heartbeat, then silence fell again. The small bodies dropped as if time itself had cut their strings. The assistant stumbled back, swearing softly. The professor only nodded, taking notes with calm precision. Though his pulse raced, he wanted to understand the reaction at a level deeper than data. He wanted to know the will behind it, if such a thing could exist in something. Without a mind afterward, he sat alone staring at the fallen flies. He thought of the forest where he had first found the plant of the bones around its roots, of how the wind that day had seemed to die at the moment he touched it. Perhaps nature had not meant for him to take it. Perhaps he had brought back something that did not belong in the walls of human understanding. Outside, the storm gathered, thunder rolling low over the horizon, and the professor felt an unease crawl beneath his skin. The air inside the greenhouse thickened, the lamps flickered, and for a moment he could have sworn the plant moved, not swayed, not trembled, but reached ever so slightly toward him, as if curious or as if hungry. He stepped back, heart pounding, but his eyes stayed fixed on it, because somewhere inside him the fear had already turned into fascination, and fascination was the one thing he could never escape. The day of the demonstration came faster than the professor expected and slower than he could bear. The sky outside was gray like ash, the kind of color that made the world seem to hold its breath, and the greenhouse buzzed with voices and footsteps that did not belong there. He had spent the night preparing the samples, cleaning the dome, arranging the tables, every motion mechanical, every thought circling the same point. What if the world was not ready for this? What if he was not ready to show it? Cameras lined at the corners of the room. Reporters adjusted their microphones. Assistants whispered directions. The air smelled of nervous sweat and sterilized glass. The professor stood in the center, trying to keep his breathing steady, his palms slick against the pages of his notes. He told himself that this was science, that knowledge demanded witnesses, yet a small part of him wanted to cover the plant again and tell everyone to leave, to let silence hold the truth a little longer. When the crowd settled, he began to speak, his voice steadier than he felt. He told them how he had found the plant by the river, how its toxins worked in seconds, how every living thing that touched it fell still before the next breath. He spoke of control, of safety, of the protocols that must never be ignored, but even as he said the words, he could feel the weight of curiosity pressing against them. The crowd did not come for caution, they came for spectacle. He uncovered the dome, the glass lifted with a hiss, and the scent filled the air, faint but sharp, a whisper of citrus and pepper that made people shift in their seats. Some wrinkled their noses, others leaned closer, drawn without knowing why. The professor noticed the flicker in their eyes, the pull of fascination that mirrored his own. The plant shimmered under the lights, alive and still and perfect. He placed a small cage on the table. Inside, a single fly hovered near the corner, its wing a nervous blur. The professor released a measured puff of air from a pump, directing a trace of the plant's pollen into the cage. The effect was immediate. The fly dropped motionless. The room went quiet, then filled with the sound of camera shutters clicking like rain against glass. Questions flew. What made it so fast? What was the mechanism? Could it be weaponized? Could it be cured? He answered as best he could, using words like enzyme disruption and cellular decay, but the truth was he did not know the full reason. He only knew that the plant killed cleanly and without hesitation, that there was no struggle, no pain, just silence. At the back of the room he noticed someone standing apart from the others, a woman in a dark coat, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She watched not with shock or horror, but with something else, something like recognition. She did not write notes. She did not ask questions. She only stared at the plant as if it were an old friend. When the demonstration ended and the crowd began to file out, the professor felt relief drain into unease. He looked again toward the corner, but the woman was gone. Only the faint scent of spice lingered in the air, sharper now, heavier, and he could not shake the feeling that the plant somehow knew her name, even before he did. The professor could not stop thinking about the woman in the dark coat. Her face lingered in his mind, more clearly than the flashes of the cameras or the applause that had followed the demonstration. He had seen curiosity in many eyes before, but what he saw in hers was not curiosity, it was recognition, and that unsettled him more than any question. The reporters had asked. He returned to the greenhouse that night, unable to rest. The rain tapping against the glass in a slow rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse in his throat. The plant looked different in the dark. Its leaves glowed faintly as if holding the moonlight. Captive, the air around it shimmered with a thin haze of pollen, and he swore he could hear a faint hum like breathing. The professor set down his notes, trying to focus on data, on the next step in testing, but his thoughts kept circling back to the woman who had vanished before he could speak to her. He wondered if she had recognized the plant, or perhaps the scent. Maybe she had seen it before in some forgotten corner of the world. When the morning came, he found her waiting outside the greenhouse as if she had been there all night, the mist curling around her boots, Her hair damp with dew, she greeted him by name, though he had not told it. She said she had seen the broadcast and wished to learn more about the plant. Her voice was calm, her tone precise, but there was a warmth beneath it that made the professor feel both cautious and drawn in. He hesitated, then opened the door, letting her step inside. She moved through the greenhouse with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged among growing things. She brushed her fingertips over the leaves of the harmless plants and smiled faintly as if greeting old friends. When she reached the dome, she stopped, her eyes softened, and she said, "It smells the same here as it did when I was a child." The professor felt his pulse quicken. He asked what she meant, and she told him she came from a small village far across the ocean where the ground burned hot beneath the roots and the soil glittered like ash. She told her that was impossible. No plant like this had ever been catalogued. No record existed in any database. She only smiled and said that not everything born of earth wished to be found. She asked if she could touch it. He refused at first, but her calm never broke. She stepped closer until she stood beside the dome, the glass fogging under her breath. She whispered a word he did not understand, and for a heartbeat he thought the plant shifted as if turning toward her. The professor felt a chill crawl down his spine. He asked again who she was. She said her name was Mara, and that in her village this plant was not feared. It was used in cooking, ground fine and sprinkled into stew. The professor laughed without meaning to, saying that was impossible, that the plant killed in seconds, but she only looked at him with a quiet certainty and said, "Then you must be preparing it wrong." The words hung between them like a spark ready to burn. The professor wanted to believe she was wrong, yet something in her voice and her calm made him doubt everything he had proven. He found himself staring at the leaves again, wondering if the plant was truly a killer or if it had simply been misunderstood, waiting all this time for someone who remembered its gentler name. The morning after Mara's visit, the professor found himself unable to think of anything else. Her words looped through his mind like a melody too haunting to forget. He moved through the greenhouse in silence, every sound sharper, every scent heavier. He stared at the dome where the plant waited, its surface glistening like the skin of something alive and aware. He could not decide whether he wanted her to return or to vanish from memory entirely, yet deep inside he already knew she would come back. When she did, the next day, she carried nothing but a small cloth bundle in her hands. She greeted him with that same calm smile, the kind that made him feel she had already seen the end of this story before it began. He asked why she had returned, and she said to show him the truth. The knowledge was not the same as understanding. He tried to laugh it off, to remind her that this plant killed on contact, that his data was irrefutable, but her eyes did not flinch. She simply said, "Then let us see which of us is right." He wanted to stop her. He wanted to call security to end this before it began, yet he did not move. When she walked to the table, he followed as though pulled by an unseen thread. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small bowl, a pinch of salt, a wooden spoon, and a battered tin cup. She asked him to open the dome. He hesitated long enough to feel his reason crumble, and then he did. The hiss of the seal releasing filled the air. The scent of the plant unfurled, rich and sharp. Mara smiled and plucked a single leaf between her fingers, rolling it gently as if testing its texture. The professor felt sweat bead along his neck. He told her to stop, told her she was risking her life, but she only murmured something under her breath, a sound like a prayer or a memory, and dropped a leaf into the cup from her bag. She drew a small vial filled with fine gray dust and poured a pinch into the cup, then added water from the tap. Stirring slowly, the air seemed to thicken around them, as if the greenhouse itself leaned closer. The mixture darkened to a deep green. She lifted the cup to her lips and drank. The professor froze, his breath trapped, his mind counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. He waited for the collapse, for the silence that always came, but she stood there, eyes closed, a faint smile curving her lips. She breathed deeply and exhaled steam like warmth on a cold day. Then she opened her eyes and said, "Tastes just like home." He stumbled back, his voice breaking, as he demanded to know how she was still standing, how she could drink what killed everything it touched. She answered that where she came from, the earth fed differently, that the soil was filled with minerals that changed the plant, that tamed its venom, turning death into spice. She said the land itself taught her people balance, and that perhaps his science had only ever seen half the truth. The professor felt the ground tilt beneath his certainty. He looked at her and at the plant, then back again, and for the first time since he began this work, he realized that he had never truly known what he was studying. Perhaps the plant was not the anomaly. Perhaps he was the night stretched long and sleepless. After Mara left, the professor sat in his office, surrounded by open notebooks and the faint hum of the greenhouse beyond the glass. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of thunder. He replayed every moment of what he had seen, her calm, her steady hand, the way she had swallowed the liquid as if it were tea. Every rule he knew, every measurement he trusted had cracked under the weight of that single impossible act. He returned to the dome past midnight, unable to resist the pull. The plant stood in the same still perfection, its leaves faintly pulsing with light. He stared at it and whispered, "What are you?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but not unheard for, he swore. The shimmer across its surface deepened, as if it breathed the same air he did. He reached out, his gloved hand but stopped halfway. His reflection on the glass wavered in the low light, and for a moment he thought he saw Mara's face staring back instead of his own. He began new tests in secret, grinding samples, isolating compounds, measuring the reactions under different minerals. He remembered the gray dust she had poured into the cup and sent for soil samples from the region. She had mentioned days passed without sleep, without hunger, each test revealing something that should not have been possible. The toxins did not vanish in the presence of the mineral. They transformed the molecular structure, twisted, but instead of destruction there was fusion. The deadly became edible, the poison became heat and flavor. It was not neutralization, it was convergent. He stared at the results, unable to decide if he felt awe or dread. He understood now that the plant was never just one thing. It changed according to the land, according to the hand that touched it. The same creation could kill or nourish depending on what the world around it chose to give. He thought of Mara again, and her calm certainty that truth was not absolute, that knowledge without balance was blindness. He had laughed when she said it, but now he felt the echo of her words in every line of date. At dawn he stood before the dome, the greenhouse, bathed in gray light. He unlocked the seal and let the air breathe between them. The scent filled his lungs, and for a heartbeat he felt dizzy, not from fear but from wonder. He took a pinch of the soil he had mixed with the imported mineral and spread it gently around the roots. The leaves trembled faintly as though sighing. The glow softened, and the sharpness in the scent faded, replaced by something almost sweet, almost alive. In a different way he whispered her name, and the sound of it steadied him. "Mara," he said. "I believe you." The words came out like confession, like surrender. He realized that his search for control had blinded him to the simple truth that life did not ask for understanding, only respect. He closed the dome again, his heart still racing with the thrill of what he had discovered, or perhaps with the terror of what it meant outside. The first light of morning broke through the clouds, and the professor stood watching it spread over the rows of glass and steel. He felt smaller than ever, but not defeated. Something inside him had changed, something that could not be measured or written down. Perhaps the plant had been teaching him all along, not about death but about humility. The professor stood before his reflection in the glass door of the greenhouse, the morning sun rising behind him in a slow, pale glow. He looked older than he remembered, lines carved deep across his face like the roots beneath the soil. He had spent his life studying. He had spent the last few nights rewriting everything he thought he knew about the plant and about himself, yet the words on the page never seemed enough to hold what had changed inside him. He had seen a miracle that defied every principle he trusted, and he could not decide if it was revelation or madness. He knew the Council of Scientists would not believe him. They would call it contamination or coincidence. They would ask for data, and when he showed them, they would still call it error. He had once been like them, unwilling to see past the boundary of numbers and instruments, unwilling to think that the world could still whisper truths that did not fit inside a chart. But now he felt something larger moving beneath those boundaries, something that pulsed with the rhythm of the earth itself. When Mara returned, he was ready, though the sight of her still disarmed him. She carried a small satchel over her shoulder, her steps light as though she had walked out of the rain instead of through the city. She looked around the greenhouse, smiling softly as if greeting an old friend. The plant shimmered at her presence, the glow along its leaves warming slightly. She noticed and said, "It remembers me." He tried to reply, but the words tangled somewhere between disbelief and wonder. She asked what he had learned, and he showed her the charts, the graphs, the notes. She listened quietly, not interrupting once, and when he finished she said, "You have found the reason, but not the meaning." He frowned, asking what she meant. She told him that in her home they did not study the plant to control it. They learned to live beside it, to respect what it could do, and to never take more than the soil offered. She said, "When they cooked with it, they added at last just enough to wake the flavor, never enough to command it. Balance was the law of their world, not mastery." The professor felt her words sink deep. He realized then that his entire life had been an attempt to master what could only be understood through coexistence. He asked her why she had come so far to show him this, and she said because the world he lived in had forgotten how to listen, because someone needed to remember that knowledge without humility, would one day destroy the hand that held it together. They stood before the dome, the plant quiet and still. Mara reached out, her palm resting gently against the glass, and the professor did the same on the other side. He felt warmth through the barrier, as though the plant itself breathed between them. She said softly, "This is what your kind forgets, that life does not belong to you, it only passes through you like wind through leaves." The professor did not speak, he only watched as the morning light spread across the dome, the glow of the plant and the glow of the sun merging until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began, and in that silence he understood that discovery was not about possession but about connection, and that perhaps this moment was the real experiment, the one he had been meant to find all along. The professor did not sleep that night. The silence of the greenhouse pressed against him like the surface of deep water. The air inside was still and heavy, and yet alive in ways he could not explain. He sat at his desk staring at the sealed dome, the plant glowing faintly under the dim emergency lights. It was not just a specimen anymore, it felt like a presence, a quiet, breathing thing that knew more than he did. He thought of Mara's last words and the way her voice had carried the weight of warning and memory. He wanted to protect what he had found, but he also knew secrets never stayed buried for long. By morning, the university corridors were already buzzing with rumors. Word of the strange demonstration had spread faster than he imagined. Reporters had started camping near the gates and officials demanded an update. His inbox overflowed with messages from colleagues, half curious, half skeptical. The dean called for a presentation, saying the world deserved to know what he had discovered. The professor stood by his window watching the fog drift over the campus. He thought of how quickly the world consumed new things, twisted them, repackaged them, sold them as progress. He felt a quiet dread that this discovery would become another weapon dressed as Wandi. He went to the greenhouse. The air was cool and sharp with that familiar spice scent. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The sound of the outside world faded behind him. The plant shimmered in the morning light, its surface pulsing with a faint rhythm like a heartbeat. He whispered to it as though it could hear him, telling it that soon others would come, that they would want to touch it, to test it, to take pieces of it until nothing pure remained. For a moment, he thought the glow dimmed as if it understood what was coming. That afternoon, the committee arrived, a cluster of scientists with cameras, tablets, and lab gear. Their voices filled the room with a cold excitement. They treated the greenhouse like a stage, not a sanctuary. The professor guided them through his notes, his charts, his graphs, but his voice wavered. He told them about the transformation of the toxin, about the minerals that changed death into flavor. Some of them laughed, others frowned. One asked if he could replicate the process at scale. He hesitated, then said softly, "Perhaps, but at what costs?" When one of them reached toward the dome, the professor's heart thudded. He wanted to stop him, but the words caught in his throat. The gloved hand brushed against the glass, and the plant reacted. Sleeves flexed and released a shimmer of light, fine as dust. It drifted across the air like mist. The scientists stepped back, coughing, waving their hands, but the professor stood still, watching in awe as the pollen settled harmlessly around him. The light faded, leaving behind only the faint scent of spice, the same scent that had once made Mara smile. The others looked at him wide-eyed, waiting for his explanation, but he said nothing. He only watched the plant. Its calm returned, its glow soft once more. He realized then that it had chosen restraint, that it had shown mercy where none was owed. He turned to the others and said quietly, "It does not trust you." And in that silence, the truth hung between them, vast and unspoken. The kind of truth that would not survive in reports or headlines, the kind that only the earth itself could keep. That night, when everyone was gone, the professor stayed behind. He sat beside the dome and whispered that he would protect it, that some knowledge was not meant to be shared just yet. And as the lamps dimmed, he thought he saw the faint outline of Mara's reflection in the glass, smiling as if the plant had carried her memory in its roots all along. The dawn came slow and silver, the sky painted with thin clouds that drifted like smoke. The professor sat in the greenhouse where the air hung heavy with the scent of soil and spice he had not left since the night before the data sheets were scattered. Across the floor, the dome stood silent before him, the plant glowing faintly as if breathing in rhythm with his heart. He felt the weight of choice pressing down on him like a storm waiting to break. Outside, the world clamored for answers. Reporters camped at the gates. The university board demanded an immediate statement. He could not decide if truth was meant to be told or protected. He rose from the chair, his joints aching, his reflection rippling faintly across the glass. He looked older, more fragile, but also clearer than he ever remembered. He whispered to the plant, saying that they would take it apart, that they would call it resource, call it progress, turn it into something to control, something to own. He said that they would never see its beauty or its mercy. They would never understand what it meant to coexist instead of conquer, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to still, as if the greenhouse were listening. He opened the dome, the seal released with a soft sigh. The scent burst outward, rich and warm, not threatening but alive. He reached in his hand, trembling yet steady. He touched one leaf, bare-skinned for the first time, expecting the sting of poison, but there was none. Instead, he felt a pulse beneath his fingertips, faint but steady like the rhythm of a distant drum. His breath caught. He felt warmth spreading through his arm, not pain but lightness, as if the plant were sharing something ancient and patient with him. He closed his eyes and let it happen. Vision flashed behind his eyelids, fields of green, under alien suns, forests, whispering with wind that carried both life and death, rivers running through red soil that glittered with minerals. He saw Mara standing among them, smiling, her voice a whisper, threading through the hum of the world. She said softly, "You see now, Professor, it was never about danger, it was always about balance." He opened his eyes and found himself back in the greenhouse. The plant quiet once more, its glow dimming like a candle. After prayer, he knew what he had to do. He gathered his papers, stacked them neatly into a single box, and locked them away. He sealed the greenhouse records, marked the research as inconclusive, and filed the specimens under restricted access. He wrote one final line in his notebook: "Knowledge without humility leads to ruin." Then he placed the notebook beside the dome and turned off the lights, leaving only the soft, natural glow of the plant to illuminate the room. That evening, as he walked away from the greenhouse, he saw the first stars rising, the world around him unaware of the miracle it still held. Beneath the glass, he felt a strange peace settle over him, a quiet that was not emptiness but acceptance. He knew that one day others might find what he had found, but perhaps by then they would listen better. He looked back one last time and thought he saw the faint shimmer of light within the dome, like a heartbeat, steady and alive, and somewhere inside that glow he thought he heard Mara's voice again, saying softly, "Sometimes truth must sleep before it can bloom." And he smiled, because for the first time he understood